Hello and welcome back. My oldest brother, my husband and I went to Japan and South Korea in fall 2023, and I would like to share my art haul with you. Right now the currency exchange rate is heavily in our favor, which is why I bought so much. This video will be very long because I will also swatch all of these items, so just grab a drink of your choice and let's get started. I will start by showing you the classic art supplies, paper, paint and brushes. My most expensive purchase was this watercolor sketchbook by Avalon. I believe this cost 3,000 yen. It's 100% cotton paper and there are 12 pages in the sketchbook. It's made by Holbein, the same company who also produces gouache and watercolors. You've probably heard of them. We will take a closer look at this one later. The next one I actually bought in South Korea in an art supply store in Seoul, but it says on the paper that it's made in Japan. This paper was fairly cheap. It cost 13,500 won, the Korean currency, but it does include some percentage of cotton. There's not much more information on this paper and the backside is blank, but we will also take a closer look at it later. Now for the paints. I purchased the 24 color set of Gansai Tambi Art Nouveau watercolors. This one cost 3,000 yen as well, which actually means I paid less for 24 colors than I would have paid for the 12 color set in Germany. What I hadn't realized is that these two sets are not actually identical. I thought the set of 24 would simply be the set of 12 plus 12 more colors, but that's not the case. I couldn't find the set of 12 colors in the art shop though, so here we are. You might notice that the pens are very large, but they're actually not as deep as the pens you can buy from European or American manufacturers. I will swatch all of these paints for you in a moment. For now, let's continue. Next up is the Midori Notebook, produced by Midori, and we will see this company again later. For some reason I had looked into buying this before. It was just really difficult from Europe. This is a notebook especially designed for drawing, and it says on the backside that it's made with 20% cotton and it opens fully flat. We will also test this one in more detail later. Next up are the brushes. The larger one is called Sanraku brush and it cost 880 yen. And the smaller one is a Pentel design brush for 330 yen. The Sanraku brush is more of a student grade. This is what this little scale here means. And it has a fairly hard tip, which is this scale down here. I have other brushes from Japan which are mega soft, so I was looking for a harder one this time. Moving on to stationery, here are the pens that I brought from Zebra, called Sarasa pens. These are so-called vintage colors, and I really like the selection. The tip is 5 millimeters wide, and I'm going to swatch them really quickly later. Now we have my favorite purchase. This is a brush pen with a wider and a finer tip. The brand is Zebra again, and this brush pen is called Fude. The wider tip is relatively stiff, but the thinner tip is rather soft, and it makes even my boring handwriting look kinda pretty. The shop where I bought this also had a brilliant selection of stickers, so I couldn't resist getting some of them. I've tried bullet journaling before, and I want to give it another shot next year, so these are meant for that. Each one of these was 250 yen, except for the index numbers, which were 280 yen. My next art supply is not actually an art supply, it's a chopstick stand, but I figured I could place 2 brushes on the wings of this little origami crane. I did find a proper brush stand later during our journey, but by that point I'd already bought this little crane. We are moving on to art-related things now. I really like the design of this calendar. The colors are really bold and it's got these ripped edges. Here you can see the pages inside and the edges. The brand is Midori, once again, same as the notebook. And it comes with this little ribbon here to hang it. You just need to poke a hole through the top of these pages. What's interesting is that you can basically cut out or rip out the center of all of these pages and then use them as postcards, or I guess hang them around your home as art. This one was a bit more expensive at 2090 yen. Just as a side note, the weeks start with Sunday in this calendar. And speaking of postcards, I found these 2 very interesting wooden postcards. They are a bit too nice to actually put them in the mail, so I think I would just use them to decorate our home. These prints are artworks by Utagawa Hiroshige. He is an ukiyo-e artist. This is woodblock printing. These wooden postcards were 500 yen each. Speaking of woodblock printing, here's another master. This is a book or magazine about Hokusai. This is the same style as the artworks by Utagawa Hiroshige on the wooden postcards. This magazine introduces Hokusai as an artist and covers 100 of his most famous works. It's read from the back, from our perspective. One of his most famous works is The Great Wave of Kanagawa, this one here. And it's one of my favorites as well. My second favorite is Red Mount Fuji, right here. Hokusai created a number of landscape wood prints, but also some flower prints that I didn't know about yet, and some demons and mythical creatures towards the end of his life. There are also some postcards included in this magazine. Now, as you saw earlier, this magazine is read from the back and from top to bottom, right side to left side. You can see this very well in the index page. And this is quite in contrast to our next book, which is read from the left to the right and front to back, same as our books. This one might be my most useful purchase. This is a book about how to draw hands in several poses, and it's written both in Japanese and in English. These were drawn by the artist Moa, and you can even download these poses, and you are allowed to trace them and even use them commercially if you want. So here you can see the index. The artist included empty-handed poses as well as poses where 1 or 2 hands are shown. What I really like is that she shows all of these poses from a variety of angles, which is very helpful. Some of these poses might be very Japanese in nature, like how to hold your cup noodles, but I think almost all of these can be translated to other situations as well. There is even an illustrated index in the back, so you can easily find what you're looking for. Normally, I tend to buy books in the used bookstore in Japan because they have a huge chain of used bookstores. But this one and the other books came from a regular bookstore, and they're somewhat pricey. I also bought a book of high fantasy illustrations. This is just to inspire me. This book features several artists with different styles, and I particularly like the environments. Last but not least, we've got a bit of art, but from South Korea this time. This here is a decorative fan that we bought in Seoul. It's a bit difficult to get into the frame of the camera because it's so large, but this is hand painted on handmade paper. We also bought a little stand for it, but my husband paid for it, so I don't actually know the price. In the same road, we came across a store by an artist who paints very impressive ink paintings, and we bought one of them on a wall scroll because we figured we can transport this more easily. This here is the business card of this artist and his social media accounts. Some of his work also features characters from pop culture. My brother bought a painting that featured Star Wars characters. Before we move on to the swatches, I'm going to give an honorable mention to interesting art supplies that I saw but did not buy. I discovered this set by Kisho of 20 very dark and moody paints, but I didn't want this many dark reds and greens, and it kind of overlaps with a set I already have, so I didn't buy it. I also saw these sets, which are a combination of the Kuretake brush pens and the Kuretake Gansai Tambi watercolors, and they include some postcards with pre-printed designs on them. I didn't buy them because I bought the bigger set of the watercolors and I already own Zig brush markers, but these could be a great gift if you have a friend looking to get into watercolors. My biggest regret is not buying this book of paintings by the watercolor artist Abe Toshiyuki. I browsed through it but decided against it because I'd already spent so much money in the bookstore. But his paintings look almost like photographs but more colorful. And I've put this on my Christmas wish list because I regret not buying it. Now we're going to get into the swatches. The wider tip of the zebra brush pen is relatively hard, but the softer side gives you a great variety of strokes, very thin and a bit wider ones. The Sarasa vintage pens threw me for a loop because the tips are all covered by these little pink balls that you need to take off first. Also, there are no color names on these, but they are basically black, gray, violet, red, and yellow. The yellow pen looks a bit like yellow ochre to me. These are waterproof for the most part. If you go over them with water, they keep their shape, but there will be just the tiniest bit of color that comes off, which could be a very nice effect if you like that. Next, I tried out the brushes. I tend to be stingy when it comes to brushes, but there's a saying in German, if you buy cheap, you end up buying twice. And I think this Sanraku brush is going to be such a case. I was very happy with the width of the stroke and the variety that I could get, but it lost so many hairs just when I tried it out. The Pintel design brush, the thinner one, did a lot better, and I've been using it for finer details. Now it's time to open the Gansai Tambi Art Nouveau set. All of these paints have their names written on the back side, but unfortunately no information about pigments or light fastness. I use the thinner end of the sign pen to label my swatch sheet. And just when I was done with it, I realized that there is also a swatch sheet on the inside of the cover. So oops there, but I just ended up swatching on both sheets of paper. Here goes hair number 1 of the Sanraku brush, by the way. I will let you watch the rest of the swatches with some music. Here we go. These are all the paints that I included. In general, this is a very bright set, and I suspect that a lot of paints include the white. I'm not sure how well you can tell, but some of the browns and earth tones are granulating colors. As a shadow color, you get shadow green, and you would have to mix this with other colors in order to get deeper shades. I tried out some combinations that I could think of on a separate sheet of paper because I wanted to know what would mix black or what would mix gray. Your best option for black would be mixing the shadow green and the Venetian red, but it still looked fairly green to me. Alternatively, I have this set of Japanese colors. I believe it's released by Kisho, the one that also released the larger set of shadow colors. And these could be a nice supplement for the Art Nouveau set. The shadow green does overlap between the two sets, but it's actually my most used paint out of this set of shadow colors, so I don't mind having a second one. I tried the Art Nouveau set out in this watercolor coloring book by Saku Ems, and I really like the way it looks, but the granulating earth tones did make her face look a bit smudged, so I would not use this set for portraits. Now we are taking a closer look at the Midori Notebook. This one does not have any lines, it's completely blank, and it's got 20% cotton paper. It's intended for drawing, and it's supposed to work with inks as well. It comes with a sort of sticker and a sleeve on the outside. And there's some sort of wrapping paper around it that I'm sure is meant to protect the journal. I noticed relatively quickly that all of these pages are super thin. I tried out my pens in the back and you can see them through the backside. They don't bleed, but there's a lot of ghosting. Watercolors sort of work, but there's a lot of warping of the paper. But my glass dip pen did not feather, and it feels super smooth and nice to write on this paper. I would not use water-soluble pens in this journal because I could not rewrite mine completely. I test most of my papers by drawing BB-8. This is not because I'm deeply in love with this character, but rather because I kept my initial sketch and I can easily transfer it to paper using a light box. In fact, this paper was so thin that I did not need one. This character usually also allows me to use several techniques that I like to use with watercolors. That's why you'll be seeing this one again 2 more times in this video. But initially I was too nervous to use watercolors in this journal, so I tried it with colored pencils. But I have to admit I don't like the result very much. I think this paper might simply be too smooth and you really cannot layer the colored pencils the way that you can on a more textured paper. As you can see here, I also put a piece of paper underneath it because everything from the next page was showing through and I found it very distracting. But if you work in this journal from front to back like a normal person, then you should be fine. Here you can see a little sketch of a grapefruit done in watercolors. It came out much nicer than I thought it would, and I actually like the way it looks on this paper, but it warped a lot. And you really can't use watercolor techniques such as lifting on this paper. I thought perhaps it would be better to use acrylic pens in this journal, so I gave it a try. You might notice here that I was unable to erase some of the lines. So that's one more thing to keep in mind when working in this journal. And even my acrylic pens were way too juicy for this paper. This is a stone lantern, which we saw on our trip in Japan. And the lines are all fairly straight, but once we get further into this painting, they will appear wobbly because the paper warped so much. think this journal is much more suitable for small watercolor sketches or maybe some ink work or line art using pens and things like that, but not so much paint. Even thicker acrylic paint or gouache could be too much for this paper. I was actually super lucky. I saw later that the paint almost seeped through the back of the page onto the next one. I think I'd mostly be using this journal for very rough sketches, maybe a couple of color studies or concept work for more detailed pieces. If you do wish to get this journal yourself, just keep in mind how thin the paper is and that you most likely won't be using the left side of any double page. The Watson paper, on the other hand, turned out to be a real diamond in the rough. I didn't expect too much of it because it was super cheap. And they really don't tell you how much cotton is in this paper. It's only glued on one side and there's absolutely nothing on the back side. So not a lot of information about this paper. It has a little bit of grain, like a cold pressed paper, but there's not enough texture to really bother you if you're working with markers or pens on this paper. Once I started to use watercolors on this paper, I was very surprised because the paper just felt very comfortable and almost familiar to work with. I rarely find a paper where I immediately feel comfortable with it. Usually it takes a little bit of time. It's also very obvious that there's really a high degree of cotton in this paper. I'm guessing around 80%, but I haven't been able to find information on this online. I'm doing some lifting and layering tests here and also checking if masking pen or masking fluid is going to rip the paper. And this paper manages to strike a good balance between letting me lift paint, but also letting me layer paint. There's only a slight amount of smudging if you're layering onto a thick layer of paint, but if you're layering onto a thinner layer, then it's fine. And the masking fluid did not damage the paper at all. So here is our next BB-8. I bet you've been all dying to see this one. To be honest, it's usually when I compare all of my BB-8s that the differences between the papers really become apparent. I could tell here that this paper is still smooth enough that sketching feels very comfortable and the pencil lines came out clean. Whenever I remember to do so, I also use the exact same colors for these BB-8 tests because this would tell me something about the vibrancy of the paper that I'm testing. When I color in the rings on BB-8's body, I also learned something about how fast a paper dries, because while I'm still working on one end, on some papers the other end will have dried by the time I get there and result in a visible edge. This did not happen with the Watson paper. I also like to try out my glass dip pen for finer details, and when I put the shadow beneath his dome, I can observe if it will smudge the orange ring on the left side of his head or not. Same goes for when I apply a shadow around his sphere-shaped body to really make it look like it's round. Sometimes this will smudge the orange rings on some papers. This was all fine on this paper, but once I applied the background is when I noticed that this paper is much thinner than the ones I usually work on. I had forgotten at this point that it's only 190 GSM, so it does warp more than the 300 GSM papers that I usually work on. But I'm very pleased how I was able to fade the yellow background into white, because this is an effect that I use a lot. I've also worked a bit more on this paper since then. Full disclosure, I traced the outlines and facial features of this kitten, because I didn't have a lot of time before Christmas, and it's a sentimental piece. This is the cat of my brother and his wife, who passed away earlier this year, so I was extra careful to get everything right. This paper was very forgiving. I was able to lift a lot of paint that ended up in the wrong spot, but unfortunately, because of the light paper weight, the water pooled and ran into some areas where it wasn't supposed to go. So I had to make use of this a lot of times as well. And sometimes I overworked the paper a bit and it started to fuzz and come apart. So I put down more paint onto these sections, or I added my signature right there, or applied some white gel pen so that you're not really able to see where this happened. But all in all, I'm super pleased with this paper. I also saw on the Japanese Amazon that they do sell this paper with different paper weights. So if I'm back in Japan in the future, I'll be keeping my eyes open for that. As the last big section of this video, we are looking at the Avalon watercolor paper. This one is 100% cotton and 300 GSM. And it comes with this interesting kind of sleeve here, which gives you the characteristics of this paper. It says that it's a medium grain, 300 GSM, and then it's strangely repetitive in telling you that there are 12 sheets of paper in this block. And it has a book binding, and I guess spring just means the spiral binding. There's also this interesting diamond-shaped graph. I'm not sure what is meant by all of these words. It basically tells us that the surface is quite strong and resilient, and you can use a bunch of techniques on it, and your paint will sink in and dry relatively slowly. The text also mentions that you can use masking fluid on this paper, so maybe this is meant by surface strength and resilience. Let's open it up. I find the paper size quite interesting. It's 23 centimeters by 27.6. That's 9 inches by almost 11 inches. The paper grain is quite noticeable. I hope you can see it here. There is no perforation around the spiral binding, so you'd need to separate any pages from the sketchbook very carefully by hand. But the entire sketchbook feels very nice and high quality. I'm doing a number of tests here. I can erase quite well. I'm also putting down some masking tape and masking fluid to see if it will damage the paper once I remove it. I'm putting down some paint to see if I can apply it very evenly and if I can get a nice gradient to white. And that kind of worked, but I can still see a thin line. I also applied some red, and this is supposed to be a low staining color, and that's why I bought this particular red. I tried some lifting on it, but for some reason the lifted area started to shrink. And here I'm just messing around. I usually have a hard time letting water and paint do its own thing, so this is similar to what I tend to do when I'm working in watercolors. Dry brushing works quite well on this textured paper, as you might guess. Because I wasn't too happy with the lifting, I gave it a second attempt, and interestingly enough, you can see where I did the first round of lifting and where I did the second round of lifting. I ripped off the masking tape, but it did not damage the paper at all. Fine liners and pens will look more uneven on this paper grain. I tried to soften some of the lines that had dried already, and this was really difficult to do. Layering or glazing, on the other hand, works quite well. I did get some smudging where the blue was deeper, but I think it might not have been fully dry yet. The masking fluid also didn't damage the paper, but it came up a bit unclean in bits of the tea. This might just be my lack of experience with masking pen though. And you can guess what's next. Here's our BB-8. I had to clean up a lot of lines with the eraser because they came out very uneven on this textured paper. The paint went down very smoothly. I just noticed later on that I seemed to lack a bit of precision for some finer details. I tried to get some finer lines by using a thin brush instead of my glass dip pen, but I think that just made it worse. The paper almost seems to spread out some of the paint, which results in relatively thick lines. I did end up smudging a lot of the orange details. I probably didn't wait long enough for them to dry properly. On the other hand, I accidentally ended up with a grey spot on the background and I was unable to lift it, and applying more paint on top of it also didn't make it move at all. Detailed subjects such as this BB-8 illustration aren't really suited for highly textured papers, so this might not be an entirely fair test, but it does help me get to know this paper nonetheless. The gradient that I used for the background went down very smoothly, but I could see once it had dried that there were some harder edges. But I dropped in some paint belatedly and it did not create any blooming effects. Let's look at the two BB-8s on our watercolor papers side by side. On the left side is the Avalon paper, the last paper that we tested, and on the right side is the Watson paper. I can see clear differences in the lifting and in how smooth the gradient to white is. Also, the difference in the appearance of the 1mm liner is quite striking. I know I personally prefer the Watson paper, but some people will love the harder edges on the Avalon paper because it gives a very painterly effect. This really depends on personal preference and which techniques you like to use in your art. Before you go, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and this is not a sponsorship or anything, but as an artist it can be difficult to find photos that you're allowed to paint because of the copyright of the photographer. So I've been using this website called Unsplash as a source for a lot of my reference images. And I've also started to upload my own photos to this website. I have uploaded over 100 photos from our trip to Japan and South Korea to Unsplash. There's mostly buildings here, but also a lot of shrines, gardens, temple gates, and a couple of castles. If there's anything here that you find particularly interesting, but you're hoping for a different angle, please feel free to message me, because there were so many pictures that included other people and you're not allowed to upload them unless you have a model release form. So I might just have more photos of the same location. This here is the lamp that you saw me paint earlier. So yeah, I hope this would come in useful to some of you. I'm definitely looking forward to painting a couple more scenes from our trip. If you made it through this entire video, thank you for your attention and your patience, and I would love to hear which one of these supplies you like the most. See you next time. Bye bye.